She pressed both hands flat against the church wall to keep herself standing. Not from grief. From the effort of holding herself together, while the entire town of Willow Creek watched Vernon Holt announce loudly publicly, without shame, that Thomas Marsh's widow could not pay her debt and would lose her home by winter. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not one person stood up for her. Eleanor Marsh straightened her spine, picked up her empty basket, and walked out alone. She did not know a rich cowboy was watching from across the street. And she did not know that what he saw in that moment would change both their lives forever. If that already hit you somewhere deep, subscribe to this channel. I'll follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The eggs were gone, and Eleanor Marsh knew it before she even looked down. She had felt the basket tip. She had felt the handles slip through fingers that were cracked at the knuckles from 3 straight days of washing other people's laundry in water so cold it made her joints ache. She had felt the whole morning, every careful step of it, every calculation about which vendor would give her the fairest price, every mental arithmetic about flour and salt, and whether she could stretch the last of her husband's cornmeal through the end of the week. She had felt all of it slide sideways in the space of 2 seconds, when Hattie Drummond's shoulder connected with hers on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile. Hattie had not apologized. She had laughed. "Oh, mercy," Hattie said to the woman beside her, loud enough for the 3 men lounging outside the barber shop across the street to hear clearly. "I hardly even saw her. You'd think a woman her size would be hard to miss." The women with Hattie laughed too. A thin, pretty sound like glass breaking in a room where someone else had to clean it up. Eleanor crouched on the boardwalk and gathered what was left. 4 eggs were gone entirely. 1 was cracked, but not shattered. She tucked it carefully against her palm, already calculating whether it would hold long enough to get home. Her hands were steady. She had made them steady years ago. Steadiness was something she had practiced the way other women practiced piano, deliberately, and with full understanding that she would need it for the rest of her life. "Don't mind her," she heard Hattie say, quieter now, but not quiet enough. "She's been looking like that since Thomas died, like she's waiting for someone to take care of her, as if anyone in this town would take on that particular burden." Eleanor stood up. She did not look at Hattie Drummond. She looked straight ahead at the far end of Main Street, where the road curved out toward the eastern rangeland and disappeared, and she made her face do what she needed it to do, which was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The nothing face had taken her a long time to build. She was proud of it in the way that she was proud of most things she had built under difficult circumstances. She walked home. The house was small, and it was hers, which was the only reason she had not sold it yet. Thomas had built it before they were married, had put up every post himself during the summer of 1879, and Eleanor sometimes thought she could still feel his hands in the walls when she pressed her palms flat against the wood on cold mornings. She had kept the property taxes paid through the first winter after his death by taking in mending, through the second winter by washing laundry. Now, in the summer of 1883, she was starting the 3rd year of this arithmetic, and she was beginning to understand that arithmetic had limits. She set the cracked egg on the table and stood in her kitchen for a long moment looking at it. The egg held. She thought good. Then she thought about dinner, about tomorrow, about the linen order that Mrs. Patterson had canceled last week, without explanation, after 6 months of reliable weekly business, and about the $3.40 currently folded inside the blue handkerchief in the back of the bedroom drawer, which was the sum total of Eleanor Marsh's financial security in this world. She thought about all of it, the way she always thought about it, methodically, without flinching, the way you examined a wound, to assess how bad it actually was before you decided whether to panic. Then she put water on for washing. She had been in Willow Creek for 11 years. She had come as a bride at 19. Thomas Marsh's wife, arriving on a Wednesday in October with 2 trunks and a hope chest, and a belief held privately, and with some tenderness, that she was the kind of woman a place like this needed. She had not been wrong exactly. Willow Creek needed women who could work hard and cook well and manage a household through drought years when the money ran thin. It needed women who could nurse a sick husband through 3 winters and bury him without falling apart in front of the congregation. What Willow Creek did not need, Eleanor had come to understand, was a widow who took up space. She was not small. She had never been small. Even as a girl in her parents' house in Missouri, she had been the biggest of her sisters, wide-shouldered and solid-built, like a woman meant to carry things, which she supposed was accurate. She had a face that people described on generous days as handsome wide brown eyes, dark blonde hair going to copper in the summer sun, a mouth that her mother had once told her was too expressive for your own good. She had always thought of herself as a practical woman in a practical body, and she had never spent much time worrying about what anyone else thought of it. But Willow Creek had opinions. Willow Creek had always had opinions from the first week she'd arrived, and the church women had looked her up and down with that particular measuring expression that she would come to know very well over the next 11 years. And those opinions had gotten louder somehow after Thomas died, as though his presence had been, among other things, a kind of permission for her to exist in the town the way she did. As though without him, she was just too much, too large, too present, taking up too much of the available air. She had learned not to hear it. Or she had learned to hear it and let it slide past her the way water slides past rock, acknowledging the contact without being moved by it. Most days, that was enough. Today had not been a good day. She heard about Nathaniel Walker, the same way she heard about most things in Willow Creek, which was from Margaret Tilson, at the post office, who had a gift for information that bordered on supernatural. "He's back," Margaret said 3 days after the eggs pushing Eleanor's mail across the counter with an expression of barely contained significance. "Walker came in last night with 6 hands and a herd of cattle that I am told is something to see." "Good for him," Eleanor said. "They say he's been in Montana, some business about land." Margaret leaned in slightly. "They also say he's looking to take on household help for the big house. His housekeeper left when he went north and he's been without since." Eleanor looked at her mail, which was a bill from the hardware store and a circular from a dry goods company in Abilene that she could not afford. "That's interesting," she said in a tone designed to close the subject. Margaret, who had been managing post offices since before Eleanor arrived in Willow Creek and was not deterred by closed subjects, pressed on. "It pays well from what I hear. The Walker Ranch has always paid well. And you are—" She paused with the particular delicacy of someone being kind on purpose, skilled in that area. "I manage my own household just fine." "Your own household is one person." Margaret said it gently. "His household is 8 men, a cook's kitchen, a main house with 6 rooms, and no one running it." Eleanor took her mail and her circular and walked out into the Willow Creek summer, which was already pressing down on the town, with a weight like a hand on the back of your neck. She did not think about the Walker Ranch. She thought about it all the way home. She knew who Nathaniel Walker was, the way everyone in Willow Creek knew him, by reputation and by sight, not by conversation. He was 10 years older than her and had owned the biggest working cattle ranch in the county since his father died in 1876. She knew that he was considered fair by his hands, that he paid on time and did not cheat on weight, that he had not remarried after his wife Sarah died some years back. She knew his face from church and from the occasional convergence of their errands in town. A man built on a large scale, dark-haired and sun-darkened, with the kind of steady physical presence that came from years of working land that required your full weight against it. She had never spoken more than 5 words to him at one time. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to walk up to a man she barely knew and ask for work. She was also not going to spend the winter on $3.40 and a cracked egg. These 2 facts circled each other in her kitchen for 2 days, while she took in a hem for Agnes Carroll and redarned 4 pairs of socks for the minister's family, and made calculations with a pencil stub on the back of the Abilene circular that did not add up no matter how many times she tried them. On the 3rd morning she put on her good dress, the green wool with the small brass buttons at the collar, and she walked out to Walker Ranch. The ranch road was long and straight, and the summer heat was already building by 8 in the morning. Eleanor walked it without complaint, carrying herself the way she always carried herself in public, shoulders back, chin level, the particular posture of a woman who has decided that dignity is the one thing nobody can take from you without your permission. She heard the activity before she saw the house. The sounds of a working ranch, cattle and horses and men calling to each other across distances, the rhythmic percussion of someone hammering in the direction of the barn. Then the house came into view and she stopped walking for just a moment. Not because it was grand, though it was, but because it was clearly in need of someone who cared about it. The porch railing had come loose on the left side. The window boxes were empty. The step to the front door had a crack running through it that would be dangerous in winter ice. Her hands were already cataloging it. She walked up to the front door and knocked. A young hand opened it, maybe 17, with hay in his hair and an expression of complete bewilderment at finding a woman on the porch at this hour. "I'm looking for Mr. Walker," Eleanor said. "Tell him Eleanor Marsh would like a word with him, please." The boy disappeared. She stood on the porch and looked at the loose railing and thought about how she would fix it, a simple matter of new hardware and 30 minutes of attention. And then the door opened again and Nathaniel Walker was standing in front of her. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance. He filled the doorframe in a way that was not aggressive but simply factual, the way a large tree fills its space. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his eyes were darker than she'd expected, a brown so deep it was almost black, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man trying to figure out what is happening before he responds to it. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. "Mr. Walker." She met his eyes directly. "I'll be brief. I understand you need a housekeeper. I need work. I am competent. I am reliable, and I am standing on your porch at 8 in the morning rather than sending word through Margaret Tilson, which I think tells you something about how seriously I mean both of those things." A pause. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way men usually looked at her, which was with the quick appraisal that ended in dismissal, but with something more like actual attention. "You walked out from town," he said. "I did." "That's 3 miles." "I'm aware." Another pause. Then something shifted in his expression very slightly, in a direction she couldn't quite read. "Come in," he said. "We'll talk." The kitchen was exactly what she expected. Functional but neglected, the kind of room that had been used by men who cooked only what they needed to survive and cleaned only what they couldn't ignore. She stood in the middle of it, while Walker leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, and she made her case in plain language, which was the only language she had ever had much use for. She could manage a household of 10 men. She had done it before in the early years when Thomas had 3 hands working the small Marsh property, and she'd fed them all on a budget that would make most women weep. She could cook, she could manage supplies, she could organize and schedule and manage the domestic operations of the ranch with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. "I don't want charity," she said. "I want fair wages for fair work. I'm told you pay fairly." "I do," he said. "Then we're discussing a business arrangement, not a favor." He looked at her again with that focused attention. "What happened to the Marsh property?" "I still have the house. The acreage I sold after Thomas died. I kept the house." "Why?" She considered the question. "Because he built it," she said finally. "And because it's mine." Something in his face moved again. A small thing. She noted it without understanding it. "When can you start?" he said. "Monday," she said. "If we agree on terms today." They agreed on terms. He offered more than she'd expected, and she did not show it on her face, but she made a note to think about that later. She walked back to town with the sun higher and the heat heavier, and something in her chest that she identified after careful examination as relief, though it was very close to something else that she chose not to name yet. She started on Monday. By Wednesday, the hands had opinions. Not cruel ones, exactly, not openly. But she was aware of the way conversations shifted when she came into the cookhouse, the particular quality of silence that followed her through rooms, the way Clem Hooper, the oldest of Walker's regular hands, watched her from under the brim of his hat, with an expression that could have been suspicion, or could have been something kinder. She did not require their approval. She required that they show up for meals on time and leave the common areas in reasonable condition, and she told them so on her first morning with the same clarity she had used with Walker himself. "I'm not here to be anyone's mother," she said, standing at the head of the long kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface. "I'm here to run this house. You eat what I cook, and you respect the work I do in this kitchen, and we will get along fine. You make my job harder, and I will tell Mr. Walker directly." Any questions? No questions. What she heard as she turned back to the stove was Clem Hooper saying under his breath to the young hand beside him, in a tone she was fairly sure he intended her to catch, "She's different." She chose to take it as a compliment. On Friday afternoon, she found Walker in the main room, bent over the account books at the wide desk by the window, and she set a cup of coffee at his elbow without comment and turned to go. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. She stopped. "Sit down a minute." She sat across from him in the straight-backed chair that had probably not been used for anything but stacking mail in some time. He closed the account book and looked at her, and she waited, because she had learned that men like Walker, men who chose their words carefully, needed a moment to locate the right ones. "The men are different," he said finally. "Easier, since Monday." "The food helps," she said. "It's not just the food." She waited. "You run a tight room," he said. "Fair but tight. They respect that." A pause. "I thought you should know." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was a plain exchange, two practical people acknowledging a thing that was working, and she thought, this is a man who notices what is actually happening. That was rare. She had come to understand that it was rarer than people admitted. "Thank you," she said. "That's useful to know." She went back to the kitchen. She thought about the way he'd said, "I thought you should know," not "good job," or any of the dozen patronizing forms that compliments could take. He had said, "I thought you should know," as if the information belonged to her, as if she had a right to it. She stirred the pot on the stove and made herself stop thinking about it. The trouble came on Saturday. She had gone into town for supplies. Walker had given her the household budget and the use of the small wagon, which was a practical arrangement and nothing more, and she was loading flour at the mercantile when she heard the voice. Vernon Holt. She had known Vernon Holt for 11 years. She had disliked him for 10 of them, the 1 year of exception being the year she'd been new enough to the town to believe his friendly surface represented something real. It did not. Vernon Holt was the kind of man who held his property against his neighbors, like a weapon who sat on the town council with the particular self-satisfaction of someone who confuses influence with virtue, and who had since Thomas's death found various quiet ways to make Eleanor's already difficult situation more difficult. He had been behind the withdrawal of the church's small emergency fund that she had once humiliatingly applied for. She did not know how she knew this. She knew it the way you know certain things in a small town by the pattern of what happened and who was nearby when it did. Howe was standing outside the mercantile now with 2 other men, and he was watching her load the wagon, and he was saying something that she could not fully hear, but that was clearly about her, because the men with him kept glancing in her direction with expressions that landed somewhere between amusement and pity. She kept loading. "I hear Walker's taken on the Widow Marsh," Vernon said louder now, clearly intending her to hear it. "Can't imagine what use he finds for her out there, unless he's very lonely." The men laughed. Though even then a man has standards. Eleanor set down the sack of flour she was holding. She turned around. She looked at Vernon Holt directly in the face, which was something he clearly did not expect, because his expression shifted for just a moment into something that might have been discomfort before he rearranged it back into amusement. "Good morning, Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were at her sides. He blinked. "Mrs. Marsh, I'll ask you to keep my name out of conversations I'm not part of," she said. "I trust a man of your standing in this community understands the value of discretion." A beat of silence. "No offense meant," Vernon said less smoothly than usual. "I'm sure," she said, and picked up the flour sack and finished loading the wagon. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. She drove back to the ranch in the high summer afternoon with the smell of dust in her nose and something clarifying in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but the particular mix of the two that she had come to recognize as the fuel that kept her going when everything else ran low. The feeling that said, "You are still here. You are still standing. It does not matter what they say. You are still here." She did not tell Walker about Vernon Holt. She told the stove instead while she was making dinner, talking to it in a low voice, the way she sometimes talked to herself when the house was empty and the pressure of composure had built up enough that it needed somewhere to go. She said the things she had not said to Vernon Holt's face. The precise and pointed things. The things that would have felt good for exactly 30 seconds before making everything worse. She said them to the back of the stove, and then she felt better, and she made a very good beef stew, and by the time the hands came in for dinner, she was herself again, or the version of herself that the world got to see. Walker came in late. He sat at the far end of the table as he always did, and ate without much conversation, and she watched him without appearing to watch him the way she had gotten very good at watching things without appearing to. He ate 2 full servings. She noted that. He thanked her when he got up quietly, just to her not performing it for the table. She noted that too. She realized, starting to build a picture of Nathaniel Walker, the way she built all her pictures of things that mattered. One small observation at a time, added carefully to the ones before it, until the shape of the thing became clear. She was not sure she was ready for the shape of this particular thing, but she kept looking anyway. On Sunday evening, after the supper things were cleared, she went out to the porch to sit in the last of the light before the dark came down. The summer dark in Texas came late, and it came beautifully, the sky going through colors that had no proper names, and she sat in the chair at the corner of the porch, the one that she had claimed without meaning to, just by sitting in it twice, and let herself be tired in a way that she never allowed in company. She heard the screen door. She didn't turn around. Walker sat in the other chair, not close. Across the porch far enough to be respectful, near enough to be present. They sat in silence for a long time. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that 2 people arrive at when they have both decided without discussing it that words are not what is needed. Then Walker said, "You had trouble in town yesterday." She looked at him. "Holt," he said. It wasn't a question. "It was nothing," she said. "It wasn't nothing," he said. "I heard about it from Clem, who heard it from one of the Drummond boys who was there." A pause. "I'm sorry that happened." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not your responsibility." "You work for me," he said. "Anything that happens to you because of that is my business." She looked out at the last of the light. "He's been..." She stopped, started again. "He's been making things difficult for a while, since Thomas. I don't know exactly why. Men like Vernon Holt don't need much of a reason." "No," Walker agreed. "They don't." Another silence. "You handled it right," he said finally. "What you said to him. Clem said you looked him straight in the face and didn't flinch." She was surprised by how much that mattered. She shouldn't have been. But it did. "I've had practice," she said. "I know," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the rangeland, and his face was hard to read in the changing light. But there was something in the set of his jaw that she recognized, not quite anger. The thing that came before anger when someone you cared about had been treated without decency. She looked back at the sky. She thought, "Be careful." She thought it clearly and deliberately, the way she thought all necessary warnings to herself. "Be careful, Eleanor. This is a man you work for. This is a practical arrangement. This is a thing you cannot afford to be confused about." The sky finished its colors and went to dark. Walker said goodnight and went inside. She sat on the porch for a while longer, alone with the sound of the ranch settling into nighttime around her, and she pressed her hands together in her lap and felt the roughness of them, the cracked knuckles, the years of work in every line, and she thought about what it meant that a man had just told her she hadn't flinched. She thought that might be the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. Then she went inside and put out the lamp and lay in the dark of the small room off the kitchen that was now hers, and she stared at the ceiling, and she was very careful not to hope for anything. But she was awake for a long time. She had been at Walker Ranch for exactly 9 days, when the first real trouble walked through the front gate wearing a smile. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, more than one moving with the particular unhurried confidence of people who expected to be received. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window, not to look out at the yard, but to listen, because she had learned that what people said in the moment of arriving told you more about them than anything that came after. "Nathaniel." The voice was a woman's, warm, practiced, the kind of warmth that has been calibrated over many years for maximum effect. Eleanor did not move. Cecilia. Walker's voice from the yard. Neutral. Not unwelcoming, but not the voice of a man who had been hoping for this visit. I heard you were back. I've been meaning to call for a week, but you know how August gets. A pause. I brought Mother. Eleanor went back to the stove. She heard them come inside, two women. The sound of their shoes precise on the wooden floor. The particular rhythm of women who moved through other people's houses with ownership. She had time to straighten her apron and turn from the stove before the kitchen door opened, and Cecilia Holt stepped through it. She was not what Eleanor expected, and Eleanor was annoyed at herself for that, because she should have expected exactly this. Cecilia Holt was Vernon's younger sister, 32 years old and unmarried, dressed in a traveling suit that cost more than Eleanor's monthly wage, with a face that was genuinely lovely, in the precise way that Willow Creek understood loveliness, narrow and fair, and arranged into an expression of pleasant surprise that was clearly not surprise at all. "Oh," Cecilia said, looking at Eleanor with that carefully composed expression. "You must be the new housekeeper." "Eleanor Marsh," Eleanor said. "Can I get you something, coffee or tea if you have it?" Cecilia looked around the kitchen briefly, the kind of look that was also an assessment. "Nathaniel really has let this place go. Though I suppose that's what happens when there's no proper woman running things." She said it pleasantly. She said it as if Eleanor were furniture. Eleanor put the water on. Cecilia's mother, a tall woman in her 60s named Prudence Holt, settled herself at the kitchen table with the ease of someone accustomed to settling herself wherever she chose, and said without preliminary, "You're Thomas Marsh's widow." "I am," Eleanor said. A pause filled with unspoken conclusions. "How long have you been out here?" 9 days. "And Nathaniel Mr. Walker, is he satisfied with the arrangements?" Eleanor set cups on the table. "You'd have to ask him." Prudence Holt looked at her with sharp eyes that were nothing like her daughter's practiced warmth. They were assessing eyes, the eyes of a woman who had spent decades taking the measure of other women and filing the results for future use. "I will," she said simply. Walker came inside an hour later, and Eleanor heard the conversation shift, heard it go from the kitchen to the main room. Heard Cecilia's voice take on a softer register, the one designed for men specifically, and she told herself firmly that she was not listening, and then she listened anyway, because the house was not large, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "You need someone proper managing this house, Nathaniel," Cecilia was saying. "I've been saying it for 2 years. It reflects on you how the place is kept." "The place is being kept," Walker said, "by a widow who needed the work." A pause, soft and pointed as a hat pin. "I only mean people talk. You know how Willow Creek is." "I know how Willow Creek is," he said. "Mother and I could help you find someone more—" Another pause, suitable. "Someone with better standing in the community." Silence. "Mrs. Marsh has better standing in this community than most people who've been talking about her," Walker said. His voice was quiet, and it was final in the way that a door closing quietly is still a closed door. "She's doing good work. I'm satisfied with the arrangement." Eleanor stood very still in the kitchen, with her hands around a mixing bowl. She heard Cecilia make a sound that was socially graceful and meant none of what it sounded like, and then the conversation moved to cattle prices and summer grazing, and she breathed again slowly and went back to the bread she was making with hands that were after a moment completely steady. She realized, going to have to be very careful with Cecilia Holt. Not because she was afraid of her, because she recognized her. She recognized the particular kind of woman who operated through social pressure, the way other people operated through open conflict. Clean hands, no visible marks. Nothing you could point to and say, "Look, this is what she did." Eleanor had grown up in a town full of women like that. She knew exactly what they were capable of, and she knew that the most dangerous thing you could do was underestimate the damage that could be done by a woman who smiled while she worked. JK. The bread turned out well. Clem Hooper ate 3 slices at supper and said out loud, and to the table, "Mrs. Marsh, I don't know what you put in this, But if you keep feeding us like this, I'm never leaving this ranch." The table laughed. Real laughter, the kind that belongs to people who are comfortable with each other. Eleanor stood at the counter and allowed herself a small private satisfaction. Not a smile. Something quieter than that. Walker looked at her across the kitchen. Just for a moment. Then he looked back at his plate. She thought about it later, lying in the dark in the small room off the kitchen, the way she thought about everything she needed to understand. The look had not been personal. It was the look of a man acknowledging that something was working. An employer acknowledging an employee. She said this to herself clearly and firmly, and believed about half of it. The second week she found the account ledgers. She was not looking for them. She had no reason to look. The household accounts were what Walker had given her, and nothing more, but she was reorganizing the storage room adjacent to the main office, and she found a stack of ledgers on a low shelf, and she glanced at one, not to pry, but because she was a woman who had managed her own household finances on a shoestring for 3 years, and the structure of a well-kept ledger was as natural to read as a recipe. What she saw in it made her stop. She closed the ledger. She stood in the storage room for a long moment. Then she opened it again and looked more carefully, because what she had seen seemed wrong, and she needed to be sure she hadn't misread it. She had not misread it. There was a discrepancy in the account. Ledgers, a pattern of small subtractions that were consistent enough across 3 months to be intentional and irregular enough in the amounts to be designed to go unnoticed. Someone had been drawing from the Walker Ranch operating accounts in amounts too small to catch at a glance, too regular to be coincidence. She put the ledger back exactly where she found it. She went back to the kitchen. She made supper. She spent the entire time it took to cook a pot of beans and a chicken, thinking about what she had seen and what it meant, and what, if anything, she was going to do about it. She was the housekeeper. The accounts were not her business. She had been here 11 days. She did not know enough about the operations of this ranch to understand what she had actually found. But she knew what a pattern of quiet theft looked like. She had seen something similar once in the accounts of a neighboring family in Missouri, and the man who had been doing it had been trusted for years. She told Walker that night. She waited until after supper, until the kitchen was cleared and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and she knocked on the open door of the main room where he was working, and he looked up from the desk. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to know before I tell you that I was not looking through your accounts. I was organizing the storage room, and the ledgers were there, and I read one. I'm sorry for that, but I saw something you should know about." He was very still. "Show me," he said. She brought him the ledger. She stood at his shoulder while he looked at the pages she indicated, and she watched his face go through something that was not quite anger yet. It was the thing that came before it, the cold comprehension that precedes the heat. "How long have you been looking at numbers?" he said. "Since I was 16, she said. "My father kept the accounts for 3 businesses. I helped him." He looked at the ledger for a long time without speaking. "This is 3 months, he said finally. "That's what I saw. There may be more." He nodded once slowly. He was looking at the numbers, the way she imagined he looked at difficult ground, with the full weight of his attention without hurry. "You could have said nothing," he said. "I couldn't," she said simply. He looked up at her. The look lasted longer than the ones before it. She held it without flinching. "Thank you," he said. The same way he always said it, quietly, directly, without performance. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and thought about that look. She thought, "Eleanor, stop." She put the kettle on and made herself think about something else. She went into town on Thursday for supplies, and she wore her second-best dress because the green wool was too hot for the August weather, and because she was not going to pretend, not even to herself, that she had no standards. She went to the mercantile and the feed store, and she moved through her list efficiently, and she was nearly done when she heard her name. Not from Vernon Holt this time, from Agnes Carroll, who had always been one of the more decent women in Willow Creek, not courageous, but decent. The kind of woman who would not join in cruelty, even if she lacked the spine to oppose it openly. "Eleanor." Agnes touched her arm lightly. Her face was the complicated face of a woman who wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how. I heard you're working out at the Walker Ranch. That's right. Agnes stopped, looked around briefly. I just wanted to say that I think it's good, that things are going well for you. Eleanor looked at her. Thank you, Agnes. And I wanted to say, another stop, people are talking. You know how they are, about you being out there. I wanted you to know that not everyone is saying unkind things. It was so carefully worded, so carefully hedged. It told Eleanor everything she needed to know about what people were saying. That it was bad enough for Agnes Carroll to feel she should mention it, and that Agnes Carroll did not have the courage to repeat it directly. I appreciate that, Eleanor said. Truly. She walked to the wagon. She sat in the seat for a moment before she picked up the reins. She thought about what it had cost Agnes Carroll to say that how much social risk that small gesture had required in a town like Willow Creek, and she thought that this was how courage worked. In most places, it came in small amounts from people who could only afford small amounts, and you had to be grateful for it without expecting more. She picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. Walker met her at the edge of the yard when she got back. This was not his habit. He was not a man who hovered or managed unnecessarily. He had given her the household to run, and he let her run it, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, in the measured way she was allowing herself to appreciate things about him. So when he was standing at the yard gate when she pulled in, she knew immediately that something had happened. "What's wrong?" she said. "Clem found something in the bunkhouse this morning," he said. He took hold of the horse's bridle, a habitual gesture, and looked up at her. "Someone's been going through the supply inventory, not the household accounts, the main supply stores, counting stock." She stepped down from the wagon without his help, which was her habit. "Counting or taking?" "Both, I think. I need to go through the numbers tonight, and I could use a second pair of eyes that knows what it's looking at." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "After supper," he said. "After supper, then." She went inside and started cooking, and she was very aware in a way that was inconvenient and persistent, that Walker had come to the yard gate to tell her this himself, and that he had asked for her specifically, and that this meant something about how he had categorized her over the last 2 weeks that was different from where she had started. She told herself it was professional. She kept telling herself that all through the making of a very good supper. They worked at the desk for 2 hours, side by side, not quite touching, with the ledgers spread between them, and the lamp turned up, and the sound of the summer night outside the window. She showed him the pattern she had found in the household accounts again, and then they moved to the supply records together, and she watched him think. Watched the way he held a pencil between his fingers and tapped it once against the page. When he found something significant, watched the small economy of his movements, the way he never reached for something without being sure he needed it. It was, she thought, a very strange thing to find attractive. She immediately told herself she had not found it attractive. "There," she said, pointing to a line in the supply records. "That's the same structure. The amounts are different, but the interval is the same every 12 to 15 days. One person," he said. "Someone with access to both. Someone who's been here a while," she said. "This kind of pattern takes time to establish. They had to learn what numbers get examined and what numbers get overlooked." He looked at her. "You think they're still doing it?" "I think the pattern hasn't changed," she said. "Which means either they don't know it's been noticed, or they don't believe they'll get caught." "Or both," he said. "Or both," she agreed. He leaned back in this chair, and she felt the shift of air when he moved. She was very aware of how close they were in the small space of the desk. She was professionally and appropriately unaffected by this. "I'm going to have to let someone go," he said. He said it without visible emotion, the way you say something that you know is true and that you do not want to be true. "I know," she said. "It's going to cause talk. People will have theories." "People already have theories," she said dryly. He looked at her for a moment. Something changed in his face, not quite a smile, but a movement in that direction so brief she almost didn't catch it. But she caught it. "Thank you," he said. The same word, the same quiet delivery. But it landed differently tonight. She felt it land. She closed the ledger. She stood up. "Good night, Mr. Walker," she said. Nathaniel, he said. She stopped. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. You've found 2 separate financial irregularities, and you've made this house into something that actually functions. You can call me Nathaniel. She looked at him. He looked back. Good night, Nathaniel, she said. She walked to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment, with her hand still on the latch, and she thought Eleanor. This is a place where you work. This is a man you work for. These are the facts of the situation. She knew the facts. She went to bed. She did not sleep for some time. The person drawing from the accounts was Danny Reeves. He had worked for Walker for 4 years. He was 26 years old, with a wife in Laredo and a gambling debt that he had apparently decided Walker could help him service without Walker's knowledge. Walker told Eleanor this the next morning in the kitchen, before the hands were up, standing at the far side of the table, with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been betrayed by someone he trusted. He admitted it when I showed him the ledger, Walker said. Didn't fight it, just sat down and put his head in his hands. Eleanor set coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup. What will you do? She asked. I've sent him back to Laredo. I'm not going to bring the sheriff into it. A pause. I should probably. But his wife is... He stopped. She doesn't know about the debt. And the baby just came. She looked at him. She thought about what it said about a man that his first thought after being stolen from was about the thief's infant child and unknowing wife. You're a decent man, she said. She said it plainly the way she said everything without dressing it. He looked up at her. Don't put too much on that, he said. It was not false modesty. It was something more honest, the statement of a man who knew his own limits and was not interested in being made into something larger than he was. I know the difference between decency and sainthood, she said. I'm not confusing you with either. He looked at her for a long moment. That steady, focused attention that she was starting to recognize as the particular way Nathaniel Walker looked at things that interested him. I didn't figure on you when I hired you, he said finally. Figure on me how? A pause. He turned the coffee cup in his hands once. I figured I was hiring someone to cook and keep the house. I didn't figure I was hiring someone who'd... He stopped. You change the quality of the room, Mrs. Marsh, when you're in it. She was very still. Eleanor, she said, because he had told her to call him Nathaniel, and it seemed only fair. The corner of his mouth moved. This time it stayed. Eleanor, he said. She went back to the stove. She kept her back to him for a long moment and breathed very slowly and let the heat from the stove be the explanation for the warmth in her face. Breakfast in 20 minutes, she said. I'll be here, he said. Cecilia Holt came back on Saturday. Alone this time, no mother, no buffer, arriving in a light buggy driven by a hired hand who waited in the yard with the patient expression of someone paid to wait. Eleanor answered the door because Walker was in the north pasture and she was the one in the house, and there was no useful alternative. Cecilia stood on the porch, looking if possible even more composed than the first visit. She was wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a basket, and her smile arrived a precise half-second before her words, which Eleanor recognized as a trained response rather than a genuine one. I brought some things for Nathaniel, she said. Preserves, and I made that shortbread he used to like. A brief pause. May I come in? Of course, Eleanor said, and moved aside. Cecilia came into the kitchen and set the basket on the table and looked around with the appraising quality that she seemed unable to suppress even when she was trying to be warm. It looks better, she said. Cleaner. Thank you, Eleanor said. You've been busy. A pause. I heard about the business with Danny Reeves. News like that travels fast in a town like Willow Creek. She arranged the jars on the table with hands that were quite graceful. I also heard that you were the one who found the irregularity in the accounts. Eleanor was quiet. People find that surprising, Cecilia said pleasantly. A housekeeper with an eye for bookkeeping. My father kept accounts, Eleanor said. I learned young. How useful. A pause. And how convenient. For Nathaniel. She looked up from the basket, and the warmth in her expression had shifted into something cooler and more direct something. Eleanor respected more than the warmth, because at least it was honest. "You're very capable, Mrs. Marsh. I think we both understand that." "I try to be," Eleanor said. "He's a good man," Cecilia said. "He's been alone for a long time, and he's a good man, and people in this town, the right people, have certain expectations about what kind of woman would suit him. I'm not saying this unkindly." "I know you're not," Eleanor said. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands still. "What are you saying, Miss Holt?" Cecilia looked at her for a long moment with those direct, cool eyes. "I'm saying be careful," she said. "What looks like something from inside a situation sometimes looks very different from outside it." She picked up the empty basket. She smiled, the warm, practiced one. "Tell Nathaniel I called," she said. She left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the sound of the buggy faded. She was not shaken. She was not frightened. She was doing the thing she did with every difficult thing, which was examining it carefully from all angles to understand what it actually was and what it required of her. What Cecilia Holt had done was warn her off, elegantly, without a single word that could be quoted back. What she had communicated beneath the pleasant surface of it was, "You are a housekeeper. He is a rancher. Know your place before someone reminds you of it less kindly." Eleanor put the preserves in the pantry. She stood at the pantry shelf and held one of the jars in both hands and thought about Thomas, about the house he had built, about the third year of her arithmetic, about $3.40 in a blue handkerchief, and the way Walker had said her name that morning with the coffee cup in his hands. She put the jar on the shelf. She thought Cecilia Holt is not wrong that there are things to be careful about. She thought Cecilia Holt does not know the first thing about what Eleanor Marsh does or does not deserve. She went back to the kitchen. She made the shortbread that Walker used to like into a neat stack on a plate and put it on the table for supper. And when Walker came in from the pasture, dusty and tired, and saw it, he looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Cecilia Holt brought it," Eleanor said. "She came by to call. She said to tell you." Something moved across his face. "Is that right?" "She seemed well," Eleanor said. She said it pleasantly. She said it as if it cost her nothing. He looked at the shortbread. He looked at her. "I'll take my coffee in the main room tonight," he said. "After supper. Will you join me?" She looked back at him. Every careful, practical, sensible part of her said, "Say no. Say you have things to finish in the kitchen. Say good night at the appropriate distance, and keep your place, and do not complicate the one stable thing you have managed to build in 3 years." "All right," she said. He nodded and went to wash up, and she stood in the kitchen with a wooden spoon in her hand and thought about what she had just done, which was say yes to a cup of coffee in the main room after supper as if it were a simple and uncomplicated thing. It was not a simple or uncomplicated thing, but she was going to sit down and drink it anyway, because Cecilia Holt had told her to be careful about what she deserved, and Eleanor Marsh had spent 3 years being extremely careful, and she was beginning to think that careful had a limit, and she was beginning to think she might be reaching it. The coffee had been a small thing, and it had changed everything. Not dramatically. Not in the way that stories sometimes collapsed a person's entire interior life into a single decisive moment. It had changed things the way water changed stone slowly, without announcement, in a way you only noticed when you looked back and realized the shape of things was different from what it had been. They had sat in the main room for an hour and a half that Saturday night, and they had talked. Not about accounts or household management, or the practical operations of the ranch. They had talked the way two people talked when the formal distance between them had been quietly set aside without either of them making the decision out loud. Walker had asked about Missouri, and she had told him not the careful version she kept for public consumption, but the actual version. The house with the 6 children, and the father who kept 3 sets of books, and the mother who sang while she cooked, and the particular quality of grief that came from leaving a place you loved, because staying meant being smaller than you were. He had listened the way he did everything with his full attention, without interruption, with the occasional question that told her he had actually heard the last thing she said, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Then she had asked about Montana, and he had told her things she had not expected. He had gone north, he said, after Sarah died. Not immediately, not for 2 years. He had stayed and run the ranch and done what needed doing and not fallen apart, which he now understood was not the same thing as being all right. He had gone to Montana because a man he'd known since boyhood had land there and work that needed doing, and the distance had seemed like the thing he needed most in the world. He had been wrong about that. Distance did not change what you were carrying. It only meant you carried it somewhere unfamiliar. He said all of this simply without self-pity, in the same plain voice he used for everything else. She had looked at him across the room and thought, "You have been as alone as I have. The shape of it is different, but the weight is the same." She had not said that, but she had thought it, and she thought he knew she was thinking it, because he looked at her for a moment, with something quiet and unguarded in his face, before he picked up his coffee cup and looked away. She had said goodnight at 10 o'clock. He had said goodnight back. And now it was Monday morning, and she was in the kitchen, and everything was the same, and nothing was, and she was making biscuits with hands that remembered exactly what they were doing, while the rest of her was somewhere considerably less organized. Clem Hooper noticed first. He came into the kitchen for his morning coffee before the other hands were up, which was his habit, and he stood at the counter with the cup and looked at her with those careful eyes that she had learned held more understanding than he generally chose to display, and he said, "You doing all right, Mrs. Marsh?" "Fine," she said. She cut biscuits with the cutter. Clean, even strokes. "Why?" "No reason." A pause. "Walker's in a better mood than I've seen him in 2 years." She did not look up. "That's good," she said. "It is good." Another pause, longer this time. "He's a private man. People in this town have made plenty of assumptions about him over the years, and most of them have been wrong. I've worked for him going on 7 years, and there's maybe 3 people in the county that actually know him." He drank his coffee. "I'm telling you this because you seem like the kind of woman who prefers to know the actual truth of a situation." She set down the biscuit cutter. She looked at Clem Hooper. "What truth are you telling me, Clem?" He looked straight back at her. "That he hasn't talked to anyone the way he talks to you since before Sarah died. And that the people in this town who have a stake in keeping things arranged a certain way are going to notice that before long, if they haven't already." A pause. "And that some of them are going to do something about it." She was quiet. "Cecilia Holt has already been here twice," she said. "Cecilia Holt is the least of your concerns," Clem said. "It's her brother you want to watch." He finished his coffee, set the cup on the counter, and went out to start his day. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with the cut biscuits in front of her and thought about what Clem had just done, which was offer her a warning he had no obligation to give, and what it said about the kind of man he was, and what it said about the kind of place Walker Ranch had quietly become in 3 weeks, that an old cowhand felt obligated to look out for the woman running the kitchen. She put the biscuits in the oven. She thought about Vernon Holt. He arrived on Wednesday. Not to the ranch, to the mercantile in town where Eleanor had gone for supplies in the early afternoon, and it was not accidental the way he appeared at the end of the dry goods aisle with his hat in his hand and an expression of casual friendliness that she did not believe for a single second. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "Just the person. Mr. Holt." She kept moving. She had the list, and she was working through it, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of stopping. He fell into step beside her, which was a deliberate choice, and they both knew it. "I've been hearing interesting things about the Walker Ranch," he said pleasantly. "Word is, you've made quite an impression out there." "I do my job," she said. "You do." He picked up a tin from the shelf, examined it, put it back. An aimless gesture that was not aimless. "Funny thing about that job, though. Nathaniel Walker has had housekeepers before. Never kept them more than a month or 2. Never had them at his desk going through his accounts at night." She stopped. She turned and looked at him directly. "I don't know what you think you're saying, Mr. Holt, but I'll tell you plainly what I'm hearing. And what I'm hearing is a man with too much time constructing an insult that he doesn't quite have the courage to say outright." Vernon Holt's pleasant expression stayed in place. That was what made him more dangerous than most. The pleasantness never cracked. "I'm just observing." A widow in difficult circumstances, a lonely man with significant property. People naturally wonder. Let them wonder, she said. The thing is, he said, and his voice dropped slightly, lost some of its social gloss, and became something closer to what was actually underneath it. Nathaniel Walker has been a good neighbor to a lot of people in this county. He has business relationships that require a certain standing, a certain kind of life. People have expectations. He paused. The wrong association could complicate things for him considerably. She looked at him. She understood what he was doing with perfect clarity. He was not protecting Walker. He was threatening her through Walker, using the implication of harm to someone else, because he had correctly assessed that threatening her directly would not work. I'll pass on your concern, she said. Her voice was so even it was almost gentle. I'm sure he'll find it very informative. She turned and walked away. She heard Vernon Holt say to her back very quietly, I hope you won't make this difficult, Mrs. Marsh, for either of you. She walked out of the mercantile and loaded the wagon and drove back to the ranch and said nothing to anyone for the first 20 minutes after she got back. Then she went to find Walker. I was in the barn. She stood in the door and said, Nathaniel. First time she had used in front of anyone else. Clem was there working at the far end, and he glanced up and then glanced away with the discretion of a man who had seen many things and learned the value of seeing fewer. Walker looked at her face and stood up. Outside, he said. They stood in the space between the barn and the fence, and she told him about Vernon Holt with the same plainness. She told him everything, start to finish, what was said, and what was meant, and what she believed the actual intent of it was. He listened without moving. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the horses inside the barn and the distant sound of wind in the grass and her own heartbeat, which was steady because she had made it steady, but only just. He said that, Walker said. Not a question, a statement that was doing the work of something much larger. He said that, she confirmed. Walker took his hat off. He looked at it in his hands for a moment. She had seen him do this before, this particular gesture of taking the hat off, and she had figured out that it meant he was working very hard not to do something immediate. He's been after your property, he said. She blinked. What? The Marsh property, your house. He looked at her steadily. He's been after it for 2 years. Thomas owed him a debt, a legitimate one, I think, but Holt has been extending it, manipulating the interest, and I believe he has been quietly expecting that eventually you'd run out of options and he'd get the property for what the debt was worth. A pause. He approached me about it in the spring, asked if I knew of any plans you had to sell. I told him I didn't know you and it was none of my business. Eleanor stood very still. He approached you, she said slowly, before you hired me. 2 months before. The shape of something rearranged itself in her understanding. Does he know? Did he when I came to your gate that morning? I don't know what he knew, Walker said. I know that my hiring you has complicated his plans considerably. Because as long as you're working and earning wages, you can pay the debt, and as long as you can pay the debt, he can't move on the property. She breathed in slowly. He's not trying to protect you from me, she said. He's trying to remove me from this situation, because I'm the obstacle between him and my house. Yes, Walker said. She thought about the house that Thomas had built. She thought about the posts and the walls and the palms she pressed flat against the wood on cold mornings. She thought about how close she had come to losing it without ever knowing what was actually happening. Why didn't you tell me this before? She said. I wasn't sure, he said. And I didn't want you to think I hired you because of that, because of some obligation to, did you? A pause. His eyes met hers. No. I hired you because you stood on my porch at 8 in the morning and told me you were competent and reliable, and you clearly meant both. I hired you because I needed someone who could actually run this place, and you were obviously that person. He paused again. The rest of it I found out after. She believed him. She believed him the way she believed things that she had tested carefully from multiple angles and found to hold. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. And then after a moment, Eleanor, I'm going to talk to my lawyer about the debt. There may be a way to resolve it that takes Holt out of the picture entirely. She looked at him. That's my debt, my business. It becomes my business when he walks into a store in my town and uses your connection to me as a threat, he said. His voice was quiet, and it was very flat, and there was nothing gentle about it at all. That's not something I'm going to let stand. She wanted to argue. She was by nature and by practice a woman who handled her own affairs. She had been handling them alone for 3 years, and she had managed, and she did not need. But she thought about Vernon Holt's face in the mercantile, the pleasantness that never cracked, the patience of a man who was used to getting what he wanted by simply waiting. Talk to your lawyer, she said, but I want to know everything he finds. You'll know everything, he said. She nodded once and walked back to the house. She was shaking slightly. She did not let it reach her hands, but it was there in her chest, in the space between her ribs. Not fear exactly, but the aftermath of it, the adrenaline of understanding that someone had been moving pieces around her for 2 years while she was busy surviving. She made supper. She made it well. She set the table, and she fed 8 men, and she was every visible thing about herself. Afterward, she sat in her room, and she let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes. Then she stopped. Walker's lawyer was a man named George Aldrich, who came out to the ranch the following Friday and sat at the desk in the main room for 3 hours with the Marsh debt papers and a ledger of his own, and a face that grew progressively more interesting as the afternoon went on. Eleanor was not in the main room. She was in the kitchen doing what she did, but the kitchen shared a wall with the main room, and the wall was not as thick as it might have been, and she could hear, if she was not making noise, a reasonable portion of what was being said. She was not making noise. What she heard over the course of that afternoon assembled itself into a picture that made her sit down on the kitchen stool for a moment and close her eyes. Vernon Holt had not just been extending the debt. He had altered the original terms, a small adjustment buried in the language that changed the repayment structure in a way that made it mathematically impossible for Eleanor to ever fully retire the debt on what she earned. The original document that Thomas had signed bore the appropriate marks of legitimacy. But there was a second copy, and the second copy had a different date, and the second copy had the altered terms. He had been planning it for a long time, long enough to forge the document carefully, long enough to wait for Thomas to die, long enough to let 3 years pass while Eleanor worked herself to the edge of what a person could sustain, believing that if she just worked hard enough and was careful enough and held on long enough, she would eventually be all right. She sat on the kitchen stool. She thought about the eggs on the boardwalk, and Hattie Drummond's laugh, and Agnes Carroll's careful hedged kindness, and the $3.40 in the blue handkerchief. She thought about 11 years of building a life in a town that had mostly decided to look through her, and she thought about how very nearly it had all gone exactly the way Vernon Holt intended. She thought about Thomas. She thought he would be furious. Not at her, never at her. He had been a man with a long fuse and a hot interior, and he would have walked into Vernon Holt's office, and she stood up. She put the kettle on. She was Eleanor Marsh, and she was not going to fall apart in a kitchen. When Aldrich left, Walker came into the kitchen. He looked at her face, and he stopped just inside the door. "You heard," he said. "Most of it." He sat down at the table. She stayed at the counter. The distance between them was the same distance it had always been, the appropriate professional distance, and it felt different than it had 3 weeks ago. Not larger, but more significant, like a space that had been measured, and both of them were aware of the measurement. "He altered the document," she said. "Thomas signed something legitimate, and Holt changed it afterward. That's what George believes. He can prove it with enough time." "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe a month." "And until then?" Walker looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. "Until then, Holt can't move on the property because I'm going to pay the debt in full tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had experienced in the main house, and she had experienced several. "No," she said. "Eleanor, no." She turned from the counter and faced him, and her voice was level, but there was iron in it, the kind of iron that had been forged over a long time, under considerable pressure. I am not going to allow you to pay my debt. That is my house. My husband built it. My name is on it. I have been holding on to it for 3 years, and I will not have it become something I owe you." It wouldn't be. It would be. She was not angry at him. She needed him to understand that. It would be even if you never meant it that way, and I know you don't. It would be because that is what it is. And I cannot. I will not be someone who is kept. Not again. Not after everything I have done to stay on my own 2 feet. He was quiet. He looked at her for a long moment with that full attention that she had come to understand was the most serious thing about him, that capacity to really look to see what was actually there. "All right," he said. She blinked. She had expected more of a fight. "All right," she said. "You know what you need," he said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise." A pause. "But Aldrich works for me, and I'm paying him, and he's going to take this apart piece by piece until there's nothing left of what Holt did. That part isn't negotiable." She looked at him. "That part," she said carefully, "I can accept." He nodded. The distance between them was still there. It was still the same. But something had shifted in it, the way things had been shifting in small increments since the first cup of coffee on the porch. And she thought that if you added all the small shifts together, you arrived at something that was no longer small at all. The news about Aldrich's investigation reached Vernon Holt in 4 days. She knew this because on Sunday after church she still attended because she was not going to cede the church pew to anyone. Hattie Drummond appeared at her elbow with an expression that was performing concern over a foundation of something sharper and said, "I hear there's been some legal business about Thomas's old accounts." "You hear a great deal, Hattie," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Vernon is very upset," Hattie said. "He feels he's been treated unfairly." Eleanor looked at her. She looked at her with the full and direct gaze that she had once had to practice and now had entirely at her disposal. "Vernon Holt forged a legal document and has been defrauding a widow for 2 years. He is welcome to feel however he likes about being found out." Hattie's mouth opened. Eleanor walked away. She felt it between her shoulder blades as she went the weight of being watched, of being the subject of something larger than a morning's gossip, now of having stepped from the private management of her own survival into something that the whole town was going to have opinions about. She had been in this position before, and she knew what it cost. She knew the particular exhaustion of being a subject, of being the person other people constructed their conversations around. She was tired of it. She was also not going to back down. She walked out of the churchyard and down the road toward the edge of town where the Walker wagon waited, and she climbed up into the seat, and she was reaching for the reins when the wagon shifted and Walker swung up onto the seat beside her. She looked at him. He was supposed to be speaking with George Aldrich on the church steps. "That's finished," he said. "I saw Hattie Drummond corner you. I handled it. I know you did." He took the reins. "You handle everything." There was something in the way he said, not admiring exactly, or admiring, but also something underneath the admiration, something that sounded almost like it hurt. She looked at him as he turned the horses. "What does that mean?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. They were moving now out of town, the sound of Willow Creek fading behind them, and the summer air was warm and smelled like dust and dry grass. "It means," he said slowly, "that you are the most capable person I have had in my life in a long time. And sometimes I watch you handle something that would break another person, and I think—" He stopped. She waited. "I think it must get very heavy," he said, "carrying all of it, always." She looked at the road ahead. She thought about the nothing face that she had built. She thought about the 5 minutes of shaking in her room, and the eggs on the boardwalk, and the pencil stub, and the calculations that never added up, and every careful, deliberate act of self-containment she had performed in the last 3 years. All the things she had held together through sheer will because there was no one to hold them with her. She thought about what it felt like to have someone notice the weight, not offer to carry it, not diminish it with sympathy, just notice. Acknowledge that it was there and that it was real. "It does," she said. "Sometimes." He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. You don't have to carry all of it alone. Not anymore." She did not answer immediately. She sat with those words for a moment, held them carefully, the way she held the cracked egg on the walk home, aware that they could break if she wasn't careful with them. Aware that she wanted very badly not to break them. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yeah." "What are you saying to me?" He pulled the horses to a stop. They were on the empty road between town and the ranch. Nothing around them but the wide Texas summer, and he turned on the seat and looked at her with the most unguarded expression she had seen on his face. All the careful composure set down. The private man, visible underneath the man who had gone to Montana, because he needed distance, and found out that distance changed nothing. "I'm saying," he said, "that I didn't hire you for anything other than what I said. I'm saying that what has happened since is not something I planned or predicted. I'm saying that I would like to be honest with you about what it is, if you'll let me, because I find that I cannot manage being anything else with you. I've tried." A beat. "You notice too much." She looked at him. He looked at her. "You are my employer," she said. Not as a rejection, as a fact that needed to be said so it could be responded to. "I know what I am," he said. "I'm asking what you'd like me to be." The summer lay around them. The horses waited. She thought about Cecilia Holt on the porch. She thought about Vernon Holt in the mercantile. She thought about the careful, sensible voice in her own head that had been telling her for weeks to stay at the appropriate distance and know her place and not complicate the one stable thing she had. She looked at Nathaniel Walker's face, the honest, unguarded, patient face of a man who had been as alone as she was, and who was right now the bravest person in this wagon, and she thought about Thomas, and about the house, and about the rest of her life. She said, "You could start by using my name more often." Something in his face broke open quietly, like a door that had been stuck for a long time. "Eleanor," he said. "That's right," she said. He picked up the reins. I was not smiling. He was something deeper than smiling. She looked ahead at the road toward the ranch, and she felt for the first time in 3 years like the direction she was traveling was one she had actually chosen. Then the sound reached them, hoofbeats, coming fast, from the direction of the ranch. It was the youngest hand. The boy 16 years old, who had been left to mind the property, and he was riding hard in a way that meant something was wrong, and Eleanor felt Walker go tense beside her before the boy even reached them. "Mr. Walker." The boy pulled up alongside, breathing hard. "Someone came to the ranch while you were gone, left a paper. Clem said I should ride for you straight away." Walker took the paper. His face went very still as he read it. He handed it to Eleanor. She read it. It was a legal notice. A formal claim filed through the county court that morning, the same morning they had been at church, which meant it had been filed while they were sitting in pews, which meant it had been planned to the hour. Vernon Holt was not claiming the Marsh debt. He was claiming the Walker property. He had filed a prior claim, a document dated 1879, that asserted a lien against a portion of the Walker Ranch acreage based on a business agreement he claimed to have had with Walker's father. Eleanor looked up from the paper. Walker was looking at her. "He's changing targets," she said. "He's escalating," Walker said. His voice was entirely flat. "He can't get to you through the debt anymore, so he's coming straight at me." She looked at the document in her hands, the date on it, the signature. "This is the same pattern," she said quietly. "The same construction as the Marsh document. George Aldrich needs to see this today." "He will," Walker said. He turned the wagon around. They drove back toward town with the summer pressing down and something shifting in the air between them. Not the warmth of the moment before, not yet, but something made of the same substance as it, something that said, "This is a person who stands beside you. This is what that feels like." She held the forged document in both hands, and she was not afraid. She was unexpectedly something close to ready. George Aldrich had the forged Walker document on his desk for 40 minutes before he looked up and said, "This man is either very stupid or he believes he is completely untouchable." Walker was standing at the window with his arms crossed. Eleanor was in the chair across from the desk with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face doing the nothing that it did when she was working very hard on the inside. "Which do you think?" Walker said. Untouchable, Aldrich said. Stupid men make sloppy forgeries. This is careful work. This is the work of someone who has done it before and has never been caught. He set the document down. The problem is that careful work still leaves traces if you know what to look for. And I know what to look for. How long? Eleanor said. Aldrich looked at her. He had adjusted to her presence in the room over the course of the afternoon in the way that some men adjusted to capable women with initial surprise, then with something approaching respect when he understood that she was not decorative. 2 weeks to build the full case, maybe 3. He filed this morning, Walker said. He's counting on a response before then. He's counting on panic, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. He filed this the morning we were at church, the same morning Aldrich was meeting with us about the Marsh document. He knew we were occupied. He wanted us to come home to this, to feel surrounded, to make a fast decision. She paused. He doesn't want a legal fight. Legal fights take time and they create records. He wants a settlement. He wants someone to pay him to go away. Aldrich looked at Walker. She's right. I know she's right, Walker said. Then don't give him what he wants, Eleanor said. Give him the fight. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, in the way that meant both of them were thinking rather than not talking. The sun was going lower by the time they turned onto the ranch road, and the heat had begun to ease, and Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and organized what she knew into the shape of what needed to happen next. She had the pattern now. She had the full picture of what Vernon Holt had been doing, and for how long. Not just to her, but to other people in the county. She suspected people who had settled quietly because they lacked the resources to do otherwise. She had the documents, she had Aldrich. She had Walker's determination and her own. And she had the single most important advantage in any legal confrontation, which was that the truth was on her side, and the truth with sufficient evidence was not something you could forge your way around. What she did not have was time. He's going to escalate again, she said when they were most of the way back. Before Aldrich finishes, he knows we're building a case and he's going to do something to disrupt it. Walker was quiet for a moment. What kind of something? I don't know yet. Something social maybe. Something public. She looked at the road. He's been working through reputation from the beginning. With me, it was whispers. With you, he went legal. If the legal move doesn't land the way he planned, he'll go back to what he knows. Let him, Walker said. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. Let him say whatever he wants to say. He can't damage us with words at this point. She noticed the word, us. She held it carefully the way she had learned to hold the things that could break. He can damage the case, she said. If he gets enough of the county council behind him before Aldrich finishes, he can apply pressure to the judge. That's how these things work in a town like Willow Creek. It's not always about the law. Sometimes it's about who has more friends when it counts. Walker pulled the horses to a stop at the yard gate. He turned and looked at her with the full directness that she had come to understand was the most serious expression in his limited repertoire of expressions. Then we make sure we have more friends, he said. She did not know what Walker did in the next 3 days, because he did it mostly without telling her, which she respected, even as it drove her quietly to distraction. What she observed was that he rode out early each morning and came back at different times, and the men he met in the yard, or in the barn, or in town, were men she recognized by name and by their place in the county. The Garfield brothers who ran the feed operation. Old Silas Pruitt, who sat on the county council and had grown up with Walker's father, James Okafor, who had a cattle operation 2 valleys over and was one of the most respected men in the county, despite the fact that Willow Creek's more entrenched citizens had never quite made peace with how much they needed his trade. She made food for all of them when they came to the ranch. She made it well because she made everything well, but she paid attention to what they ate and what they said while they ate it, and how Walker sat with each of them, easy straight, not performing confidence, but actually possessed of it in the way that a man was when he knew the ground he was standing on. On the 3rd day, Clem came into the kitchen in the late afternoon with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was something between satisfaction and worry, and he said, "Holt went to the county judge this morning." She set down the bowl. And she said, and the judge told him the matter would be heard when the matter was ready to be heard, that any claims filed needed to go through proper procedure, and that proper procedure would take the time it took. Clem paused. He also told Holt apparently that he'd heard some concerning things about certain documents in the county, and that he intended to look into it thoroughly before making any decisions about anything. Eleanor breathed. Silas Pruitt, she said. Silas Pruitt and James Okafor between them know every important man in this county, Clem said. And they both owe Walker significant favors that have nothing to do with any of this. He looked at her steadily. He's been calling them in. She looked at her hands. She thought about Walker riding out in the early mornings. She thought about the conversations she had not been part of, and the weight of favors being shifted from one side of a scale to another. All of it in service of a situation that had started with a basket of broken eggs on a boardwalk. He shouldn't have to do that, she said. He doesn't think of it that way, Clem said. He thinks of it as correcting something that's wrong. That's just how he is. He paused. But there's something else. Holt knows he's losing ground on the legal side. He went to the judge this morning and the judge shut him down. That's a visible failure in a town like this. He's not going to take that quietly. She looked up. What do you think he'll do? She said. Clem picked up his hat from the table. He held it in both hands the way Walker held his when he was thinking. I think, Clem said carefully, that a man like Holt, when he's cornered, does the thing that costs him the least and hurts the other person the most. And the cheapest weapon he's got left is your name and what he says it means about Walker's judgment. She understood. He's going to make it about me, she said. Not the legal business, me personally. He's going to make the case to the town that I am the problem, that Walker has been compromised by his, she paused, by his connection to me. I think that's where he's heading, yes. She nodded once. All right, she said. She put her apron back on and went back to work. It happened on Saturday at the church social. She almost did not go. She had good reason not to go the household the cooking any number of legitimate alternatives, but she thought about what Cecilia Holt had said on the porch about knowing your place, and she thought about 11 years of making herself smaller in rooms where she was present, and she put on the green wool dress with the brass buttons, even though it was August, and the heat was going to be uncomfortable, and she went. Walker drove her in the wagon, and did not comment on the dress, or the decision, or the significance of her being there, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about him. The church social was held in the yard behind the meeting house, and there were 40-odd people and 2 long tables of food that various women had contributed, and Eleanor had brought a spice cake that she knew was the best thing on either table, and was not modest about knowing this. The first 20 minutes were the careful navigation of a social event where everyone is aware of a subterranean tension and managing it with the particular grace of a community that has been doing this for decades. People spoke to her. Some of them spoke to her with genuine warmth. Agnes Carroll, who gave her hand a quick press. James Okafor's wife Clara, who sought her out specifically and told her that the cake was exceptional. Some of them spoke to her with the social gloss that covered uncertainty. A few did not speak to her at all. Vernon Holt arrived 40 minutes in. He arrived with Cecilia and their mother and 2 men from the county council, who Eleanor did not know well, but recognized as being in Holt's sphere of influence. He moved through the gathering with the ease of a man at home in his territory, shaking hands, speaking warmly, performing the version of himself that worked very well in public. He did not approach Walker. He did not approach Eleanor. He approached Silas Pruitt. She watched it from across the yard, unable to hear, but reading the shapes of it, the way Holt positioned himself, the angle of his body, the gestures that were too pointed to be purely social. She saw Silas Pruitt's face go from open to carefully neutral, and she thought, here it is. Whatever Holt has decided to do tonight, it starts here. She did not move toward it. She stood where she was, and she talked to Clara Okafor about recipes, and she waited. Walker appeared at her left shoulder. He's telling Silas the legal business is a misunderstanding, Walker said quietly enough for only her to hear. That Aldrich has been fed bad information. that he's willing to settle everything amicably if people will let cooler heads prevail. He's trying to get Silas to pull back, she said. He's trying to separate the coalition before Aldrich finishes. A pause. Silas won't move, but Holt doesn't know that yet. She kept her eyes on the yard. He's going to do something else, she said. When Silas doesn't respond the way he wants. He came here with a plan, and if the first part doesn't work, he has a second part. I know, Walker said. What do you want to do? He was quiet for a moment. I want to let him. She looked at him. Whatever he does, Walker said, I want him to do it here, in front of everyone, because what he's been doing until now has been done in private forged documents, quiet manipulation, back-channel pressure. Bring it into the open and it looks different. He looked at her. It looks like what it is. She thought about that. She thought about the nothing face, and the steady hands, and the years of managing things privately, because private was safer, because public exposure always cost the person who had less power, more than the person who had more. She had believed that for 11 years. She had believed it because it was true. But there was another truth underneath it, which was that darkness required privacy to survive. That things done in whispers couldn't withstand being said out loud. All right, she said. Jenning. It took another 20 minutes. She was at the food table refilling her plate, because she was not going to stand in a field being anxious on an empty stomach, when she heard Holt's voice rise slightly above the ambient sound of the gathering, and she turned, and the social geography of the yard had shifted, people drawn by some instinct toward the configuration of tension, and Holt was standing in the open with Silas Pruitt and Walker and 3 other men, and his voice had lost some of its pleasant smoothness. I think it's worth asking, Holt said, what kind of judgment we're seeing from a man who takes a woman of questionable standing into his household and then uses her findings that she made by going through his private accounts without permission to bring legal action against a neighbor he's never had a problem with in 20 years. The yard was quiet. Not entirely, there were still conversations at the edges, children still moving, but the center of it was quiet. Walker said nothing. He looked at Holt with the flat, steady expression of a man who had decided to give something enough rope. She's a widow who needed work, Holt continued. His voice had taken on the quality of a man speaking to an audience aware of the audience performing for it. I don't say that unkindly, but we all know the situation. And when a woman in that position has access to a wealthy man's accounts and his ear and his confidence. A pause waited with implication. Well, we're entitled to ask what's driving these accusations. Eleanor set her plate down. She walked across the yard. She walked deliberately, not fast, with her shoulders back and her chin level and every year of practice behind her, and the people between her and the center of the gathering moved aside without being asked, because there was something in the way she moved that said clearly, I am going somewhere, and you should let me pass. She stopped 6 feet from Vernon Holt. Finish the sentence, Mr. Holt, she said. He looked at her. The pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned. Mrs. Marsh, he said. Finish the sentence, she said again. You were implying something specific. Say it plainly. In front of everyone here who has known me for 11 years. Say the specific thing you're implying and put your name to it. A beat of silence. I'm only observing, he began. You are not observing, she said. You are suggesting without the courage to say directly that I have manipulated my employer for personal gain. Say it, or don't say anything at all. The yard was very quiet now. Holt looked around at the people watching, and she saw him calculate, saw the calculation happen in real time, the assessment of whether he could push forward or whether the room had shifted past the point where that served him. There are questions, he said, but it was smaller now. There are documents, she said. Legal documents filed through proper channels examined by a licensed attorney that show a pattern of fraud extending over 2 years. Documents with your name on them, Mr. Holt, in ink that does not match the paper it's written on. She held his gaze without flinching. Those are the questions worth discussing. Not what you think of my character, or my size, or my standing. Those things are not on trial. Your documents are. The silence after that was the specific silence of 40 people simultaneously deciding something. Holt said nothing. He had nothing left to say that would help him. Eleanor turned and walked back to the food table. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were at her sides. Walker was there when she turned around. He had moved without her noticing, positioned himself a step behind her and to the left, not in front of her, not blocking her, just there. Present. "You didn't need me," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "But I'm glad you're here." The corner of his mouth moved. She picked up her plate. The social ended within an hour. Social events always ended faster when the subterranean tension finally surfaced. The pressure released, and the air went out of the gathering, and people remembered that they had early mornings. Holt left first. He left with his family and the two councilmen, and they left in the particular way of people who had arrived with a strategy and were departing without it. The silence around them too pointed to be comfortable. Silas Pruitt shook Walker's hand before he left and said something quietly, and Walker nodded, and that was that. Agnes Carroll found Eleanor at the food table while she was helping pack up the remains and stood beside her and said low enough for privacy, "That was the bravest thing I've seen anyone do in this town in 20 years. Eleanor looked at her. "It wasn't brave," she said. "I was angry. There's a difference." Agnes looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas would have been proud." Eleanor did not answer that. She could not answer it without the nothing face, and tonight she thought she was done with the nothing face. She packed up the rest of the food. She carried the spice cake plate to the wagon. Walker was already there, and he took the plate from her without being asked and set it in the wagon bed, and then he held out his hand to help her up to the seat. She looked at his hand. She took it. She sat up on the seat, and he came up on the other side, and they drove back in the dark with the summer night around them. And she thought about what Agnes had said about Thomas, and she let herself feel it. The grief and the gratitude and the strange complex thing that was being alive past your losses, and finding that life had kept going in directions you had not planned for. "He's finished," she said. Not triumphantly. Factually. "Aldrich thinks the formal case will take another week," Walker said. "But yes, he's finished. A man like Holt needs the room to believe he's untouchable. You took that away from him tonight in front of everyone who matters in this county." She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be angry about that," she said. "A man like that when he's humiliated publicly. He'll do something fast, and he'll do something stupid," Walker said. "That's what angry men do when they've lost the high ground. And when he does it, Aldrich will be waiting." A pause. "Let me worry about that part." "I'm not accustomed to letting people worry about parts," she said. "I know," he said. "Let me anyway." She looked at the dark road ahead. "All right," she said. They drove. Then he said, "Eleanor." "Yes." A pause. The horses moved. The night was warm. "What you did tonight," he said. "What you've been doing since you walked onto my porch, that's not what a woman does when she's trying to manipulate someone. That's what a person does when they're standing on their own 2 feet and refusing to let anyone take that from them." He paused again. "I want you to know that I see that I have been seeing it, and that it is." Another pause longer, the kind that a careful man took when the words mattered enough to get right. "It is the most remarkable thing I have witnessed in a long time." She did not speak immediately. She sat with it. "Nathaniel," she said finally. "Yeah. I need to tell you something." "All right. I came to your porch because I needed work," she said. "That was true, and it was the whole truth at the time. And I need you to know that I did not come with any other intention, because I need you to believe me when I tell you that what has happened since is not something I managed or maneuvered." She looked at him. "What has happened since is the most surprised I have been in 11 years. He looked back at her. The horses walked on. "I'm surprised too," he said quietly. "I stopped expecting it, being surprised like this." She thought about Sarah. She thought about the way he had gone to Montana and come back and sat at the head of his table alone and let the house go because there had been no one to run it. She thought about what it cost a man to admit that he had stopped expecting something and had been given it anyway. "I know," she said. He reached over without looking away from the road and put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat. He did not say anything else. She turned her hand under his. They drove the rest of the way back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with not speaking. The storm came at 3 a.m, not a metaphor. An actual storm, the kind that the Texas summer threw down without warning, the sky going from clear to furious. In the space of an hour, the wind arriving first as a low pressure and then as a physical fact that woke Eleanor out of a sound sleep, with her hand already reaching for the lamp. She heard the horses before she was fully awake. She was dressed and out of her room in 4 minutes, not because anyone asked her to be, but because she had grown up in farm country, and she knew what panicked horses meant, and she knew what unsecured stock in a storm meant, and she was not going to stay inside a house while there was something to be done. The yard was chaos. Rain hitting hard and sideways, the wind doing what wind did in a flat country with nothing to stop it, and she could hear the horses in the near corral. In genuine distress, the high urgent sound of animals that were frightened and needed to be heard. Walker was already in the yard. Clem was behind her by 30 seconds. 3 of the other hands came from the bunkhouse, still pulling on boots. "Coral fence is down on the east side," Walker shouted over the rain. He was pointing and moving and managing the situation with the particular competence of a man who had spent decades being the person who held things together when things fell apart. "Clem, take the south gate. Jefferson, get the barn doors open." Eleanor did not wait to be assigned. She went to the corral. The east section of fence was down flat, and 2 horses were already through the gap and in the dark beyond the yard, and she could hear them, their movement, their direction, and she went after them the way she went after everything, directly and without hesitation, into the rain and the dark, with nothing but 11 years of knowing what frightened animals needed. She caught the first one, a bay mare named Rosie, that she had been feeding carrots to for 3 weeks by the halter rope that was still trailing, and she talked to her low and constant and steady, the way you talked to something that was frightened, the way you had to be the calm one because there was no one else. "Easy," she said. "Easy, Rosie. I've got you. I've got you now." The mare shook and stamped and pulled, and Eleanor held on with both hands and kept talking and kept being the steady thing. And after 40 seconds that felt much longer, the mare stopped pulling. She walked her back toward the yard. Walker was at the fence gap when she came through with the mare. He had the other horse, a young gelding, harder to manage on a lead rope, and was working the animal with the controlled strength of a man who did this for a living. He looked at Eleanor with the rain coming down on both of them, and his eyes did the thing, the full attention thing, the thing that had been cataloged and stored since the first week. And for a moment, they just looked at each other across the wet dark, with a horse in each hand. "Give me Rosie," he said. "I've got her," Eleanor said. "A beat." "Eleanor," he said. "I've got her," she said again. "Tell me where you need me." He looked at her for one more second. "Northgate," he said. "Make sure it's latched. There are 2 more horses on that side." She went to the north gate. The next hour was the hardest physical work she had done since the winters of washing laundry in cold water, and she did it without complaint and without stopping. And when the last horse was secure and the fence gap was patched enough to hold until morning, she was soaked through to the skin, and her arms ached from the shoulder down, and she was standing in the mud of the yard with her hair completely undone from the pins, and she did not in this moment look like anything other than what she was, a woman who had done what needed doing. Walker came to stand beside her. He was in the same condition, soaked mud on his boots and his shirt, his hat gone somewhere in the last hour. Without the hat, he looked different, more himself somehow. He looked at her for a long moment. "You went out after those horses," he said. "They were frightened," she said. "Someone needed to go. You could have been hurt." "So could you," she said. He looked at her with something that had moved entirely past his usual careful composure, something that was raw and warm and completely undefended. "You didn't think about it," he said. "You just went." "That's what you do," she said. "When something needs doing, you go." He reached out and pushed the wet hair back from her face. His hand cupped her jaw for a moment, warm against the rain cold of her skin, and she stood very still and let it happen. Because she was done, she decided with careful. She was done with managed distance and sensible choices, and the nothing face, and all the elaborate architecture of self-protection that had kept her upright for 3 years. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. "I need to say it." "Then say it." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes in the mud and the rain and the aftermath of a storm, and he said, "I am in love with you. I don't know when it happened. I know it's here now, and it is not going anywhere, and I am done pretending otherwise." She held that. She held it carefully. Then she said, "I love you too. I have been being very sensible about it for approximately 6 weeks, and I am tired of being sensible." Something on his face, the last of whatever had been holding itself back, came apart quietly and completely. He pulled her in, and she went, and she pressed her face against his chest, and she felt his arms come around her, and she stood in the rain and let herself be held. She could not remember the last time she had let herself be held. She thought, this is what it feels like. This specific weight, this specific warmth, this person, this place, this moment that she had not expected and had not planned for and had arrived at anyway across 3 years of broken eggs and blue handkerchiefs and pencil stubs and careful arithmetic. The rain was already beginning to ease. She could feel it changing above them, the pressure shifting the storm, deciding it was done. She did not move. Not yet. The morning after the storm, Willow Creek looked at itself differently. That was how it felt to Eleanor anyway. Like the town had been shaken loose from something in the night, some settled arrangement of who stood where, and what was owed to whom, and what could be said about which people in which company. She felt it when she drove in for supplies 3 days later, and Agnes Carroll waved from across the street with both hands. Not the careful, hedged acknowledgement of before, but something open and warm and unafraid. She felt it when Silas Pruitt tipped his hat to her outside the post office and said loudly enough for the men beside him to hear, "Morning, Mrs. Marsh, you're looking well." She felt it in the particular quality of the silence when she walked into the Mercantile, not the silence of a room deciding what to make of her, but the silence of a room that had already decided. She did not let herself read too much into it. She had been in Willow Creek long enough to know that a town's opinion was a weather system. It shifted, it changed direction. It could be warm on Monday and cutting by Thursday. She had learned not to depend on it. But she noticed. She noticed everything. She was in the middle of loading flour when Margaret Tilson appeared at her shoulder with the particular expression that meant information of significance was about to change hands. "George Aldrich filed the full case yesterday," Margaret said without preamble. "Vernon Holt was served this morning." Eleanor kept loading. "And," she said, "and he accepted service without a word apparently, just took the papers and closed his door." A pause. "Cecilia came to my counter an hour ago to mail a letter to their cousin in San Antonio." She looked. Margaret searched for the word diminished. Eleanor set the last sack in the wagon. "I don't take pleasure in that," she said, and meant it. Whatever Cecilia had been to her, the composed face of the opposition, the careful social pressure, the warning on the porch. She was also a woman navigating the world, according to the tools available to her, which was something Eleanor understood down to the bone. "I know you don't," Margaret said. She paused again. "There are people saying you're the reason the case happened at all, that Walker would never have found the irregularities without you." Eleanor looked at her. "George Aldrich built the case," she said. "Walker funded it and had the standing to bring it. I found a pattern in a ledger. All 3 things were necessary." Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been running a post office and managing the information flow of a small town for decades, and knew exactly what was being done with that answer, and approved of it. "You're a careful woman, Eleanor Marsh," she said. "I try to be," Eleanor said. She picked up the reins. "Good morning, Margaret." She drove back to the ranch. She drove with her chin level and her hands steady, and something moving in her chest that was not the carefully managed hope she had been policing for weeks, but something larger and less controlled. Something that felt when she allowed herself to examine it directly, very much like the beginning of happiness. She told herself to be careful with it. She had said that to herself before, and she had meant it, and she still meant it, and she also thought that careful had to have a limit somewhere, and she was beginning to believe she had found it. Walker was at the desk when she got back, which was unusual for mid-morning. He looked up when she came through, and she could read his face, now had been able to read it for weeks, learning the small economy of his expressions, the way she learned everything. One careful observation at a time, and what she read now was that something had happened while she was in town. "What is it?" she said. He set down the paper he was holding. "Holt came here this morning," he said, "after Aldrich served him." She went still. "He came here," she said. "He did." Walker leaned back in the chair. "He wanted to talk. He said he wanted to resolve the matter before it went any further. He wanted to settle. I wanted to make it go away." A pause. "He sat in that chair and he told me that he had made some errors in judgment. That the documents had been, he called it overzealous record-keeping. That he was willing to fully retire the Marsh debt, acknowledge the claim against my property as invalid, and make a charitable contribution to the county in exchange for withdrawing the legal action." Eleanor looked at him. "What did you say?" she said. Walker looked back at her with the flat, steady expression. "I told him that the legal action was in George Aldrich's hands, and that Aldrich would need to be satisfied, not me. I told him that the decision about the Marsh debt belonged to you and not to me. And I told him that a charitable contribution did not address the question of what he had done to a widow over the course of 2 years while she was working herself to exhaustion to hold on to a house her husband built." Silence. "And then," she said. "And then he sat there for a minute, and he said—" Walker paused, and something moved in his face that she couldn't quite categorize. He said, "You've changed, Nathaniel. You used to understand how things work." She breathed. "What did you say?" "I said, I understand how things should work. That's different." He looked at his hands on the desk. "Then I showed him the door." She stood across the room from him, and she thought about Vernon Holt walking up the ranch road that morning, the confidence it required, the calculation behind it, the particular arrogance of a man who had operated without consequence for long enough that he still believed even now that everything was negotiable. She thought about what it meant that Walker had said no. That Walker had said the debt belongs to Eleanor. That Walker had sent him away. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him across the room. "I'm choosing to." He looked back at her with the thing that she still sometimes forgot was there. The warmth underneath the composure. The man who had been to Montana and come back and sat alone at the head of his table and had not expected to be surprised again. "Come sit down," he said. She sat in the straight-backed chair across from the desk. He put a paper in front of her. She looked at it. It was a letter handwritten from George Aldrich. She read it through once and then again because the first reading felt too large to absorb in a single pass. The letter outlined the full case. Both documents, the Marsh debt forgery and the Walker property claim, and Aldrich's assessment of the legal exposure involved. It also contained something she had not expected, which was a note that 2 other families in the county had come forward in the last week, with similar documents, similar patterns. The same careful construction that left just enough ambiguity to make a legal challenge costly and uncertain. Holt had done this before, multiple times, to multiple people. She set the letter down. "He's been doing this for years," she said. "Aldrich thinks at least 5 years," Walker said. "Maybe longer. The Marsh debt was not the first. It may not even be the most egregious." A pause. "The other families, the ones who came forward, they came forward because of what happened at the church social. Because you said out loud in front of everyone that there were documents with his name in ink that didn't match the paper." He looked at her steadily. "They heard that, and they went home, and they looked at their own documents." She sat with that. She sat with the weight of it, that the thing she had done at the church social, which had felt in the moment like anger, more than strategy, had cracked something open wide enough for other people to walk through. "This changes the case," she said. "It changes everything," Walker said. 5 families documented pattern years of systematic fraud. Aldrich says Holt is looking at criminal charges now, not just civil. He can settle with one person. He cannot settle with the county. A pause. "It's over, Eleanor." She looked at the letter in front of her. She thought about the $3.40 in the blue handkerchief. She thought about the arithmetic that never added up, and the pencil stub, and the particular quality of exhaustion that came from working without end in sight. She thought about 2 years of carrying a weight that had been placed on her deliberately by a man who had counted on her being too worn down to look at it carefully enough to see what it actually was. She thought about Thomas and the house and the posts he had put up himself. She was not going to cry. She had decided that firmly, and she was going to hold to it. She was not entirely successful. She pressed her fingertips to her eyes for a moment and breathed, and when she lowered her hands, Walker was looking at her with no expression at all except attention, and she thought, this is a man who lets things be what they are. He does not manage your feelings for you. He just stays present for them. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. She picked up the letter and folded it precisely. "What happens next?" she said. "Aldrich files the additional claims next week. The county judge will hear the full case. He is not," Walker said with a dryness she had come to recognize as his version of satisfaction, "a man who tolerates fraud in his county. And Holt. Holt is going to have a very difficult winter." She looked at him. "Good," she said, and meant that too, without pleasure, but without apology. The week that followed was the strangest of Eleanor's 3 years in Willow Creek. Strange because it was quiet, because she had been braced for the next thing, the next document, the next visit, the next veiled threat, delivered with perfect social grace, and the next thing did not come. What came instead was the particular stillness of a situation that has been resolved but not yet fully understood by all its participants. She kept working. She cooked and managed and organized and ran the household with the same efficiency she had brought to it from the first morning. She did not change what she did because the legal situation had changed. The work was the work, and she did it well because she did it well, and that was who she was, independent of any other circumstance. But things had shifted. The hands had always respected her. Now they were comfortable with her, which was different. Clem lingered over his morning coffee and asked her opinion about the north pasture rotation in the manner of a man genuinely curious what she thought. Jefferson, the youngest, started bringing her small things, a handful of early wildflowers, once a smooth stone. He thought was interesting, with the uncomplicated generosity of a young person who had decided they liked you and saw no reason to disguise it. Walker himself was different. Not different from what he had been becoming over the weeks, but different from the careful, composed man who had stood in the doorframe the first morning and looked at her with considering eyes. He came to the kitchen in the evenings now and sat at the table while she finished the last things, not helping, not managing, just present, and they talked the way they had been talking since the first cup of coffee on the porch, easy and honest, and without the weight of careful distance. She found that she was happy. She examined this finding carefully, with the full rigor she applied to ledgers and legal documents and all the things that mattered. She looked at it from multiple angles and tested it against the available evidence and concluded that it was real, that this specific quality of lightness in her chest, when she heard him come through the door in the evenings, was happiness, actual and genuine, arrived at by one of the most unlikely routes she could have imagined. She was happy, and she was also frightened, because she knew what it cost to be happy and then lose it, and she was not sure she had what it would take to do that again. She was working through this question one evening, standing at the kitchen window in the late summer dusk. Her work done, the house quiet, thinking about what it meant to be brave enough for happiness when Walker came and stood behind her. Not touching, just present. The warmth of him there. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the window for a moment. "About what it costs," she said, "to let yourself want something, when you've already lost things." He was quiet behind her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know that calculation. I've been making it for 6 years. She turned around. I was closer than she had realized, close enough. That turning brought her face near his shoulder, and she tilted her head back and looked at him, at the honest, unguarded face that she had learned to read, and she thought, he knows exactly what I mean. There is no explaining required. "How did you stop?" she said. "Making the calculation." "I didn't," he said. "I just..." A pause. "I decided the calculation wasn't the point. The point was whether the thing was worth the risk, whether the person was worth the risk. He looked at her. "You are worth every risk I can think of, Eleanor, and some I haven't thought of yet." She looked at him. She thought about the eggs. She thought about the nothing face. She thought about the 5 minutes of shaking in her room, and the wagon seat in the rain dark, and his hand over hers, and the way he said her name, like it was the right word for something he had been looking for. "I think you should ask me something," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Marry me." Just that. No preamble, no performance, no careful construction of the kind that a man used when he was uncertain. It was the statement of a man who was not uncertain at all, who had been certain for some time, and was simply now saying the thing out loud. She looked at him. "That wasn't a question," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. A beat. I'm not unsure enough to make it a question." She held that. She held it in both hands like a cracked egg. On the walk home, aware that it was fragile, aware that she needed to be careful, aware that it had already held longer than she'd expected and might hold longer still. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the breath of a man setting down something very heavy and being relieved to have it on the ground. He put his hands on her face, and she put her hands on his, and they stood in the kitchen with the last of the summer light coming through. And it was nothing like what she would have described if anyone had asked her years ago to describe this moment. It was quieter, and it was more specific, and it was entirely, completely real. The news traveled through Willow Creek in the way that significant news always traveled faster than was quite explicable, reaching people in orders that had no logical causality, arriving at Margaret Tilson's post office counter before Eleanor had even told Agnes Carroll. The reactions sorted themselves as reactions in Willow Creek always sorted themselves into several distinct categories. There were people who were genuinely glad. Agnes Carroll came to the ranch herself the following Tuesday and brought a jar of put-up preserves and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and said with a simplicity and warmth that meant exactly what it sounded like, "I am so glad for you. I have been so glad for you since the church social, and I should have said it sooner, and I'm saying it now." There were people who were uncertain but willing to adjust. Silas Pruitt, when he encountered Walker in town, shook his hand and said, "She's a good woman, capable. You've done well." It was old-fashioned, and it was how Silas Pruitt operated, and Walker thanked him without irony, because that was also how Walker operated. There were people who said nothing, which in Willow Creek was its own kind of statement. And there was Cecilia Holt, who came to the ranch one final time. She came alone, no basket, no pretense of social call, and she asked to speak with Eleanor, and Eleanor brought her to the kitchen, and they sat across from each other at the table, where Cecilia had once arranged jars of preserves with graceful, calculated hands. Cecilia looked older than she had 2 months ago. Not dramatically, she was still composed, still lovely in the precise way she had always been, but the composure had a different quality to it now. It was less managed, more real. "I wanted to say something before you heard it from someone else," Cecilia said. "I knew about the Marsh document, not the specifics, but I knew there was a document, and I knew what Vernon intended it to do. I told myself it was his business, and I didn't ask questions." She looked at her hands on the table. "I wanted you to know that I know that was wrong, and that I am sorry for the part I played in any of it, directly or otherwise." Eleanor looked at her. She thought about what it had cost Cecilia Holt to say this. The social architecture of a family like hers, the way loyalty and complicity and self-interest braided together until they were indistinguishable, and what it required to separate those strands enough to come to someone's kitchen and say, "I knew, and I am sorry." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. Genuinely. Cecilia nodded. "I also want to say—" She stopped. Started again. "I told you to be careful because I thought you didn't understand what you were getting into. I thought you were another stop. I underestimated you considerably. I'd like you to know I understand that now." Eleanor looked at this woman across from her, the social rival, the warning voice, the composed face of a world that had not wanted Eleanor in it, and she thought, "We are not so different. We are both women who learned to operate through limited means in a place that valued us for the wrong things. We made different choices with that, and we arrived at different places, and neither of those things erases the other. Thank you for coming, she said. Cecilia stood. You will be good for him, she said. It was not quite a concession, and it was not quite a blessing, and it was the most honest thing she had said in any of their exchanges. I intend to be, Eleanor said. The legal case concluded on a Thursday in late September. Eleanor was not in the courtroom. She had been asked if she wanted to be present, and she had said no because she had said everything she needed to say about Vernon Holt at the church social, and she did not need to be in a room watching it end. She needed to be in the kitchen at Walker Ranch doing the work that she had chosen, and that had chosen her, and that was where she was when Aldrich arrived with Walker at mid-afternoon with a document for her to sign. The document retired the Marsh debt fully completely with a formal acknowledgement that the original terms had been fraudulently altered. It restored her clear ownership of the house that Thomas built. It required no payment, no concession, no exchange of any kind, except her signature confirming receipt. She signed it at the kitchen table. Her hand was completely steady. She put the pen down and looked at the document for a moment, and she thought about Thomas, about the posts and the walls and the palms. She pressed flat against the wood on cold mornings, and she said very quietly to herself and to him, wherever he was, it's still yours. It will always be a little bit yours. And then it gets to be mine too. Aldrich shook her hand and left. Walker sat down across from her. It's done, he said. It's done, she agreed. He looked at her steadily. What do you want to do with the house? She had been thinking about this. Keep it, she said. I don't want to sell it. I want to keep it and take care of it and let it stand there the way he built it. A pause. Maybe someday someone will need it. A place to be safe while things get sorted out. It can be that. Walker looked at her with the full attention. That's a good use, he said. I think so, she said. They sat for a moment in the kitchen that had become over the course of a summer one of the most familiar places she had ever been. The stove with its particular sounds, the table with its worn places, the window with the view of the yard where she had watched the horses and the hands, and the slow accumulation of a life that was improbably and entirely hers. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it clearly. All right. She looked at him. I did not come to your porch looking to be saved, she said. I came looking for work. And I found work, and I found you, and they are not the same thing, and I need them to remain not the same thing. I need to keep being the person who runs this house because she runs it well, not because she is your wife. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said, without hesitation. And I need you to understand that what I bring to this to us is not gratitude. I am grateful for specific things the same way I expect you are grateful for specific things. But I am not marrying you out of gratitude, and I am not going to behave as though I am for the rest of my life. Eleanor, he said. Yes, I know all of this. He held her gaze. I know who you are. I have been paying close attention for 3 months, and I know exactly who you are. And I am not marrying you to be thanked. A pause. I'm marrying you because you walked onto my porch at 8 in the morning and told me you were competent and reliable, and then spent 3 months being the most remarkable person I have encountered in my entire adult life. Another pause. And because you took your hand out of mine in the rain and held on to a frightened horse instead, and then handed her back and went for the other one. And because you stood in front of 40 people and told the truth when you could have stayed quiet. He looked at her with all the composure, set down the private man, the real one. I know who you are. That is precisely why I asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about everything, the whole sum of it, from the eggs to this moment, the long road of a summer that had begun in humiliation and was ending here in a kitchen that smelled of bread, with a man who knew who she was and had said yes to it on purpose. She stood up. She walked around the table. She put her hand on his jaw, the way he had put his hand on hers in the rain, and she felt him go still under her touch, the particular stillness of a man receiving something he had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. "I know who you are too," she said. "That is precisely why I said yes." He turned his face into her hand. She thought, this is what it is to be known. This specific thing. This person, this moment, this kitchen, this. They married in October. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted the performance of it, the social statement, the occasion as a demonstration to the town of anything other than what it was. They married in the Willow Creek church on a Tuesday morning with Clem and Agnes Carroll and James and Clara Okafor as witnesses, and the minister who had been praying over this county for 20 years, and had seen enough of life to look at these two people and recognize something real. She wore the green wool dress with the brass buttons. He wore his good shirt and his hat. She walked in on her own 2 feet, because she had always walked in on her own 2 feet, and she was not going to stop now on the most significant morning of her life. I was waiting at the front of the church, and when she came through the door and walked down the aisle toward him, he did not look away. He watched her come the entire way with the full, steady, undefended attention that was the most essential thing about him, and she walked toward it without flinching. The minister said the words. They said the words back. When it was done, Walker put his hand on her face the way he had in the kitchen, and she pressed into it the way she had in the rain, and Clem Hooper in the second pew cleared his throat once and was quiet. Outside the church in the October morning, Agnes Carroll hugged her with both arms, and Clem shook Walker's hand with both of his, and Clara. Okafor gave Eleanor a small cloth-wrapped package that turned out to be a recipe for the most remarkable cornbread she had ever smelled, even through the wrapping. Silas Pruitt was there standing at the edge, and he nodded to her with the kind of respect that costs an old man something, and is given because he has decided it is owed. Margaret Tilson was not there because Margaret Tilson was always at the post office, but Eleanor would find when she went in the following week that Margaret had placed a jar of honey on the counter with her mail, and the note attached said only about time. The town of Willow Creek had been sorted over the course of a summer into the people it actually was. Some of those people were kinder than Eleanor had credited. Some were smaller than she had hoped. Most were simply human, capable of both choosing between them, doing better sometimes and worse other times. She had lived among humans long enough to accept the terms. On the first evening of her marriage, she stood at the kitchen window of Walker Ranch, which was her ranch now. Her home now hers in the specific and legal sense that the document in Aldrich's file reflected, and in the deeper sense that had nothing to do with documents. And she looked out at the yard where Clem was doing his evening rounds, and Jefferson was coming in from the north pasture, and the particular sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime were all around her. Walker came and stood behind her. He put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and she felt the weight of him, the specific, warm, actual weight of another person choosing to be present. And she thought about what she had said to him once: it gets very heavy, carrying all of it alone. She was not carrying it alone anymore. She thought about the woman who had stood in the mud on the main street of Willow Creek with a bruise rising on her jaw and broken eggs at her feet, and had not made a sound. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but the complicated tenderness you felt for someone who had survived something difficult, even when that someone was yourself. She thought you held on. Through $3.40 and a cracked egg, and 3 years of calculations that never added up. You held on, and you did not let anyone take the house, and you did not let anyone take your name, and you walked onto a man's porch at 8 in the morning on your own 2 feet, and you told the truth in front of 40 people, and you held on to a frightened horse in the rain. You did all of that, and you are still here. What are you thinking? Walker said behind her. She looked out at the yard, at the ranch, at the life that had arranged itself across one impossible summer into something she recognized as home. I'm thinking, she said, that I was wrong about something. What's that? She turned in his arms and looked at him, at the honest, patient, unguarded face of the man who had seen her specifically and completely when the rest of the world had been looking through her. I used to think that if you held on long enough and worked hard enough and didn't ask for anything, eventually you'd be all right, she said. That surviving was the goal. That if you could just get to the end of another year, that was enough. He looked at her. And now, he said. She looked back at him. Now I think surviving was just the beginning, she said. The part that came before. The part that made room for this. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he pulled her in, and she went, and she thought that this was the thing she had not known how to name, this specific gravity, this specific warmth, the feeling of being in a place where you were known and wanted and not required to be smaller than you were. She had spent 11 years in Willow Creek learning how to carry things alone. She would spend the rest of her life learning slowly and without hurry how to put some of them down. And on the days when the weight felt heavy, when the old voices were loud and the arithmetic seemed impossible, and the nothing face threatened to become the only face she had, she would come to this kitchen and he would be there, or she would walk out to the yard and Clem would nod, or Agnes Carroll's letter would be in the mail, and she would remember that the world had sorted itself over the course of one extraordinary summer into something that had room for her in it. Not the her that was small enough to be acceptable. The her that was exactly what she was. The woman who had walked onto a porch at 8 in the morning with her shoulders back and her chin level and said, I am competent and I am reliable and I am standing here because I mean both of those things. That woman. The one who had always been worth knowing. The one who had simply been waiting for the world to catch up.